Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. Every year, the run-up to an event like the Oscars or the Tonys causes us to get into arguments about which actor deserves a prize for the best performance. And in these discussions, you'll often hear the word method thrown around a bunch, usually as an adjective to describe an especially intense performance where the actor totally immersed themselves in the role. But what is method acting exactly, and where did it come from? Those are some of the questions that drive Isaac Butler's new book, The Method: How the 20th Century Learned to Act. Isaac is a critic, director, podcaster, and writer whose work has appeared in publications such as Slate and American Theater. He's also the co-author of The World Only Spins Forward, an oral history of Tony Kushner's landmark play, Angels in America. Isaac, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Michael.
Can we start off by talking about what exactly method acting is? Your book makes it clear that many of the most famous proponents of the method couldn't even agree on basic terminology, but you do keep coming back to this one Russian word, and let's see if I can pronounce it, perezhevание.
Yeah, that was good. That was good.
Awesome. What does that term mean, and where does it come from?
But sure. So perezhevание, and first I have to say I applaud your ability to pronounce it. I narrated the audiobook and discovered in preparing for that I didn't know how any of the words in the first third of my book that takes place in Russia are pronounced. I had a Russian friend pronounce them all for me into a tape recorder so that I could figure them out. And they were mostly really different from how I thought they would be. Anyway, perezhevание loosely translates as experiencing. Sometimes people translate it as re-experiencing. Like all of the various concepts associated with Stanislavski and the Stanislavski system, there's a lot of debate about the meaning. I read a whole dissertation on what it means, but let's stick to the basics because the basics are not controversial here. It is the moment where the actor's reality and the fictional reality of the character kind of merge. You're not fully becoming the character. That's not a real thing. Stanislavski thought that was insanity. I mean, almost literally insanity. But you've so entered into the imagined reality of that character that you are thinking what they think, you're feeling what they're feeling, the emotions you're feeling in the moment are genuine and they're real. Although, of course, because you're also an artist, you're able to control them. And it's really the mountaintop that Stanislavski is trying to climb with the system, and the people adapting his techniques in the United States, the biggest names of which are Stella Adler, Harold Clurman, Lee Strasberg, Robert Lewis, Sanford Meisner, Uta Hagen, and Elia Kazan. That's the thing that they're all driving at.
Yeah, Stanislavski has this whole system, which sounds very rational and scientific. But then I'm reading in your book about how he's also talking about actors emitting and absorbing rays of energy and all this stuff that sounds a little, non-scientific, maybe a little kooky. What exactly was this system and how systematic was it, really?
It wasn't very systematic at all, to be completely honest. Yeah. Stanislavski lived in an era of great scientism, the second half of the 19th century and the first 30 some odd years of the 20th. And in some ways, I feel like he was trying to legitimize his ideas by rooting them in science and scientific vocabulary and language, but it's not a science. Creativity is not a science. There's a part of the art making impulse, regardless of the art form, that is ineffable and can't be described in language. And he knew that, and he struggled with that, which is why one of the reasons why his writing can be so incomprehensible sometimes, because he's trying to describe something that can't actually be described. But yeah, ray emitting and ray absorption is a part of the system that he kind of abandons that after a while. I think the best way to think of the system, which he put in quotation marks and all in lowercase, because he didn't want it ever to be finished or codified, which is a pretty clear sign it's not a real system, is it's actually like a series of different concepts and techniques associated with those concepts. And if you learn those techniques and those concepts, you can use them to help you in the creation of a role and to, reach the state of experiencing.
Now, an institution that is associated with Stanislavski is the Moscow Art Theater, which now kind of has this people are very reverent towards it now because of its role in developing the method, or rather Stanislavski's system. But you make it clear that the reality of the Moscow Art Theater was often much messier and less glamorous than people tend to think of it now. Could you tell us a little bit about the MAT and maybe why it matters?
I can answer that second question first, which is the MAT matters because all modern theatrical practice in particularly America flows from things that Stanislavski was doing at the Moscow Art Theater. I mean, he's the guy who instituted table work, like that, the idea of a rehearsal process that's split in roughly equal fourths between table work, and then you do general blocking, and then you do specific blocking, and then you refine, and you have tech rehearsals, and then you open. That's the Moscow Art Theater's model of rehearsing. The idea that all the different elements of a production need to be unified under a vision of a director who is deeply in tune with and trying to evoke the, thematic spine of a play. That's Stanislavski, right? The idea of a spine of a play or a through line of action. I mean, he really gave us everything that particularly American, but it's not just American, but that American theater kind of relies on or is rebelling against in terms of modern dramaturgical, directorial, an acting practice. If you use the phrase story beat in a conversation, you are working in his lineage. He created that term, although he called it a bit. But the reality of the Moscow Art Theater, though, was far stormier. It was founded by Stanislavski and a guy named Vladimir Nemirovich Donchenko. Stanislavski was at that point an amateur actor and director. He was also a wealthy industrialist so he was running this company and an actual company until the Russian Revolution. The co-founder, Nemirovich, was a respected critic, playwright, and acting teacher. And they wanted to start a theater to overthrow conventional Russian theatrical practice, which was the acting style was very declamatory. But beyond that, actually, a play would be lucky to have 9 rehearsals. The dress rehearsal was not a common practice. It had just been instituted into Russian theater like a decade before I think the MAT was founded. Someone will probably fact check me on that. But there were seldom directors. Directing was a new job, as you well know. I mean, and so productions weren't really unified. The sets were stock sets. The costumes were stock costumes. They were really just at their worst, exercises for actors to show off. And so Nemirovich and Stanislavski wanted to found an art theater, a literary theater, where they would do the greatest scripts, and then they would have a unified, permanent ensemble that was rehearsing together, training together, and shared goals about what they were trying to do in art. And their star playwright was Anton Chekhov. That's the other reason why the MAT is important, is that without the MAT, we don't have the Three Sisters and we don't have the Cherry Orchard, because Chekhov had kind of given up on playwriting until they did The Seagull, which was not the first production of The Seagull, but the first production of The Seagull was a notorious flop, kind of like The Room, Tommy Wiseau's The Room. That was kind of its reputation before the Moscow Art Theater did it. Anyway, but particularly once Chekhov dies, the history, the internal politics of the Moscow Art Theater get very, very, very contentious. Nemirovich and Stanislavski essentially weren't on speaking terms for the last 20 years of their lives. They just wrote each other letters. Even though they were in the same building, they would write each other letters, or they would use intermediaries. I mean, they really hated each other, and they grew to have really different values. Nemirovich stayed rooted in the original values of the Moscow Art Theater. But once Stanislavski started working on the system, the literary became less important to him than acting. And he started using rehearsals to experiment with his acting technique. And this drove Nemirovich crazy. I mean, it really drove him nuts. And their public reputation became very controversial as well. There were a lot of people who thought they were only good for the period while Chekhov was alive, and that after that, the theater sort of slowly declined until it became pretty moribund. There were people who thought differently, but I'm just saying, so it was actually a much stormier, weirder, and from the perspective of someone writing about it, really fun to write about and hopefully really fun to read about theater. It wasn't just they did all this great stuff all the time. I mean, there were, lots of arguments, nervous breakdowns, and they had to do all of this during incredibly politically tumultuous times.
I have to confess, I'm still chuckling about the Chekhov to Tommy Wiseau comparison. That one's going to stay with me. So there's this sort of contentious, complicated history with Stanislavski's system in Russia. Now, how does that go from Russia across the Atlantic?
Well, the short answer is the Russian Revolution. But, so the Russian Revolution happens. And as a direct result of that, one of Stanislavski's proteges, a guy named Richard Boleslavsky, who everyone called Boli. So if I start calling him Boli, that's why. But Richard Boleslavsky, life in Moscow becomes increasingly uncomfortable for him because he was an officer during World War I, and sort of all officers during World War I were immediately suspect. And he was a white, which is to say a Russian liberal anti-communist. You know, he was not a communist. And he managed to tough it out in Moscow for a while because he had enlisted in the army, or rather in the cavalry, under his original Polish name, which I won't even bother trying to pronounce. But you know, his time was really limited, and so he and his wife, who had lived in the United States during part of the revolution, had this kind of dream of moving there, had this very dramatic escape from Russia. That I detail in the book. And then they bounce around Europe for a while and they come to the United States. When they come to the United States, it's during the Russian Civil War, which is a couple years after the revolution. And the Russian Civil War, combined with the NEP, which changes how state sponsorship for the arts work in Russia, really put the squeeze on the Moscow Art Theater. So their finances are kind of in ruins because they had gone from relying on ticket sales to, and you know, donations and stuff like that, or from their stockholder. They had stockholders and all this stuff. So they had sort of an existing business model that was then destroyed by the revolution, and then they got full state sponsorship, and they got like very substantial state sponsorship, and then like a good chunk of that was taken away, and so they suddenly had to make money again, but no one had any money because of, you know, the revolution. So they were in real financial straits, and politically it was getting pretty hot for them. And so a group of the Moscow Art Theater, led by Stanislavski, went on tour of Europe and the United States. They were brought to the United States by this actually Russian emigre impresario named Morris Guest, and Morris Guest brought them over. The rest of the Moscow Art Theater remained in Moscow kind of as hostages, really. I mean, it was kind of like, you know, you better come back because actually we still have all of these people over here. And so when that tour hits the United States, you know, to use another hacky metaphor or simile, I guess, it's really like the Beatles at Ed Sullivan. It's like when the Beatles landed in the United States. I mean, people went nuts for their premiere in New York. The first performance they did in New York got a 30-minute standing ovation. And, you know, you write the sentence, it got a 30-minute standing ovation. You're like, oh, that's interesting. But if you just pause to picture it, if you've ever been at a play and you've gotten to the curtain call and you've stood up and you've applauded, they've done a couple things, that's probably 2 minutes, right? A normal standing ovation at a great play is probably 2 to 3 minutes. Okay. So imagine doing that for 10 times that amount of time. And people are just bowing over and over and over again. They're crying. People are throwing flowers on the, you know. And so everyone wanted to know, how did this amazing theater pull all this stuff off? And Stanislavski deputized Richard Boleslavsky, who was living in the United States and spoke a kind of telegrammatic English, to speak on his behalf. And he started giving a series of lectures. And off that series of lectures, a school was founded called the American Laboratory Theater. And Boleslavsky ran that school. And the woman who ran acting education there was another Moscow Art Theater member, Maria Ospinskaya, who went on to have a successful career as a character actor in Hollywood. And Ospinskaya stayed actually because she was refused re-entry to Russia. A group of the actors, while they were touring the United States, were informed that they actually wouldn't be allowed back in the country. And she was one of them. And so she stayed in New York and she became an acting teacher at the American Laboratory Theater.
Now, there's this line from the American Laboratory Theater to the group theater. And kind of like with the Moscow Art Theater, the group is one of these sort of hallowed institutions. I think a lot of theater nerds, if they had a time machine, would probably go back to see one of those two, either the group or the Moscow Art Theater. But you write how it was more, and I'm quoting you directly here, an impossible machine, jury-rigged from mismatched parts, held together by the magnetism of belief, end quote. So how did this impossible machine come to be and function? And how did it take on that crucial role of creating the method?
So Lee Strasberg, Stella Adler, and Harold Klerman were all students at the American Laboratory Theater. Stella first, and then Lee came for a short period of time, probably about 3 or 4 months, and then left. And then he came back with Harold to study directing. And so they were really deeply steeped in Stanislavski from Boleslavsky and Maria Ospinskaya. At that period of time, Broadway was just getting more serious, I think, as a kind of artistic concern. You're at this point only a few years out from O'Neill winning his first Pulitzer Prize. Tastes are changing. And the main kind of serious concern on Broadway is the Theater Guild. And the Theater Guild has a subscription model. Remember, there's no nonprofit theater at this point, but the Guild has a subscription model which gives them a certain hedge against risk. And so they are able to do more serious, artistically minded productions. But what are those productions? Well, they're prestige play. A lot of them are prestige plays from Europe. They do a lot of George Bernard Shaw, and they're produced on an ad hoc producing model, which is the producing model we have today. They find a director. They're like, you seem great. They find a writer. They find some actors. They put them together. They put them on stage. There's no real vision. There's no coherent vision to that company. Just like there's no real coherent vision to a lot of our, major nonprofit theaters. And Harold Clurman, who's a real kind of dreamer, finds himself very dissatisfied by this idea. And so does Lee Strasberg. Lee Strasberg at this point is doing experiments in Stanislavski-derived technique with actors at a settlement theater, on the Lower East Side. And they're both working for the Guild, actually. And Harold's like, this isn't really what a theater should be. A theater should be like the Moscow Art Theater. A theater should have a coherent vision. And it should have people who work together all the time to make that vision. It should be a group. And they recruit a third person in Cheryl Crawford, who would go on to be a big deal Broadway producer. But Cheryl Crawford at that point is an assistant stage manager in the group, and she's in like the lit office and stuff like that. And so, to make a long story short, the three of them decide to found this theater. They, over a series of impromptu lectures that Clurman gives, they sort of create a community, and then they take a bunch of those actors with them over a summer to train together in Connecticut, and they start producing on Broadway. And they're trying to produce, in a way that will maintain those values, those egalitarian collectivist values that they are deriving from the Moscow Art Theater. They're really utopian dreamers. That's what I mean by it being held together by belief. The Great Depression has shown that capitalism's time is over. The World War I has shown that war's time is over and the nation state's time is over. What we need is America specifically, because it's a new country. And so the new American man, that's how Harold Clurman put it, the new American man is going to rise up like the phoenix from these ashes and is going to reconceive what human experience and relationships could be. That's really the dream. It's the same. It's sort of like the New Deal. The New Deal is like the political version, right? Like, we're going to create a new kind of heaven on earth. And like all utopian communities, it doesn't work out, right? But on the way there, because they last a decade, they put on some incredible performances, incredible shows, one of which wins the Pulitzer Prize. They codify this American adaptation of Stanislavski and what Strasberg is doing, which would go on to become the method. And they launched the careers of Harold Clurman, the greatest theater critic of the 20th century, right? And one of the great directors. Lee Strasberg, the probably most important acting teacher of the 20th century. Stella Adler, his chief rival. Sanford Meisner, his other rival. Robert Lewis, an incredibly important director and acting teacher, and actually probably the best writer about Stanislavski's ideas of any of them. Clifford Odets, the most important left-wing writer of the 1930s, and Elia Kazan. All of those people come out of this one organization. So they have like a really revolutionary effect on the American theater and film.
One of the striking things that I really appreciated about your book is you make it clear, whether we're talking about the Moscow Art Theater or now the group, how the rise of the method was much more complicated than we normally think. We think of, it's sort of this gospel of Stanislavski that was brought to America and then sort of turned into this single doctrine by the group. But you're writing about how it's this much more complicated process where people are simultaneously developing, refining, arguing about some of the basic concepts. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about how the method developed in this complicated way, and maybe what that means for our understanding of it today as an approach to acting?
Sure. So Stella Adler and Lee Strasberg hated each other pretty much from the start. So part of it is personality driven. This is what makes it a fun story to write about and a fun story to tell, is that you have this mix between ideas and personality, contingent events that, are out of everyone's control, everything like that. Stella Adler and Lee Strasberg hated each other. Stella Adler had been a professional actor since the age of 5. Her father, Jacob Adler, is one of the most important Yiddish theater actors in the world, in the history of the world, really, and so she was raised like a queen. She'd been there since, she'd been a professional since the age of 5. She had studied at the American Lab Theater longer than he had. She had way more acting experience, including on Broadway, than most of the members of the group. She had a kid. She had been the lover of Sergei Prokofiev. I mean, she had lived a lot more life than any of them, and she was more sophisticated than all of them, and she was a genius in her own right. And she didn't want to listen to some, shtetl nobody telling her what to do, frankly. Lee Strasberg did not like disagreement. He did not brook disagreement. He was kind of authoritarian. He was prone to yelling if he didn't get his way. And he was really confident that he had unlocked the secret of great acting. And that secret was really rooted in something called the effective memory exercise. It's probably the most notorious aspect of the method. It's not all that the method is, but it's sort of the shorthand for the method is this thing called the effective memory exercise, which is where, in order to experience an emotion, you call forth and use as material a past memory of your own in which you have felt that emotion. And the way you do that is through recalling the sensory details of the memory, the way the room you were in smelled, or what something felt against your hand, or how hot it was, or whatever. And you use those to trigger yourself, essentially. Stella Adler did not have trouble being emotional on stage. That was not her problem. She saw no value in that work, really. She thought, on top of that, that Strasberg's relentless focus on it was sick, literally sick. She would say he's a sick man inflicting his sickness on actors. That's the kind of thing she would say. And so they just argued about this all the time. Strasberg would later say that actually he wasn't really trying to do effective memory work with Stella. He was actually trying to dial her back because she had a kind of schmaltzy Yiddish theater acting style or whatever. There's one quote where he said, in the middle of one rehearsal, I said to her, if you cry one more time, I will kill you. And I meant it. So they're having this ongoing argument. Meanwhile, the group is kind of getting disenchanted with effective memory. Like they've done some great things with it, but they don't really feel like they need it anymore. And Strasberg's continuing to insist on it. And, they're getting disenchanted with it. So then Stella winds up in Paris with Harold Clurman. And while they're there, Harold Clurman's old buddy, Jacques Capot, important French director and theater critic, says, by the way, Harold, Stanislavski is here. Would you like to visit him? And so they go to call on Stanislavski. And Stella says to Stanislavski when they meet, Mr. Stanislavski, I loved acting before I studied your system. And now it has ruined acting for me and ruined me. And I take no joy from acting anymore. And he said to her, he was very open-minded to challenges to his ideas throughout his career. It's one of the things I find sort of very most admirable about him. Stanislavski said, well, if it bothers you, don't use it, but maybe you don't understand it. So come study with me tomorrow and, we'll work this out. And they studied together for weeks. And when Stella Adler came back to the group, she called a meeting of the group together and she said, I went and tracked down Stanislavski and he told me Lee got this all wrong. Effective memory is, it's part of the system, but it's not the central part of the system. You definitely don't do these exercises to go kind of spelunking into your subconscious to find trauma. Well, the core parts of the system are dramatic action and what's called the task problem. So, which sort of, we now use the term objective a lot of times. It's the thing the character wants to do. Like the character has something they need to do. And so then they do something to get it, and that it's imagination, it's research, it's the given circumstances. Those are the core of the system. And so this kind of faith versus deeds argument is waged between Stella and Lee for the rest of their lives and is waged by their students after their deaths. I mean, it's a real religious schism, and they would badmouth each other constantly after that. Stella, anytime a reporter asked her what she thought, she would say something terrible about Lee, and then Lee would refuse to use her name in interviews. He would say like, oh, an American actress I worked with for some time. He would say stuff like that. It was really, really weird. So that's the fundamental schism. A lot of people wound up on Stella's side of that schism, even ones like Bobby Lewis, who does use a bit of effective memory or personal experience in his work. in part because they just hated Lee so much. He was really unpleasant. He was a really unpleasant person. And so you sort of have Lee, who's doing this like heavily psychological and emotionally driven process with his actors. And that's what the method really is, the capital M method, because it's really what Lee taught. And then there's all these other Stanislavski-based teachers. Stella Adler, the big ones are Stella Adler, Sanford Meisner, Uta Hagen, and Robert Lewis in New York. In Chicago, you've got Alvina Krause. You have some people out on the West Coast. There's other people as well, but those are the biggies. And some of them they all have their own relationship to how much effective memory they're doing, but their primary focus is on other stuff, whether it's textual analysis or being really present in the moment with your scene partner, or style. Robert Lewis was really fascinated by style. And there's this sort of war being waged between them for the rest of the 20th century.
So the group theater doesn't make it out of the 1930s, but after World War II, method acting really kind of goes mainstream. And I was really struck by this anecdote in your book. You talk about this sort of the landmark premiere of Tennessee Williams's A Streetcar Named Desire. And Brooks Atkinson, the New York Times theater critic, goes to see it, and he barely mentions the performance of Marlon Brando, which now we think of as one of the most iconic stage performances of the 20th century. I'm just kind of curious, how do we go from Brooks Atkinson barely noticing Brando to this becoming the defining performance and taking the method mainstream?
Well, I think it's the film that did it, to some extent. Although, the play was a big hit. It ran for 2 years, and Brando stayed in it for that time. I mean, he probably called out on a bunch of performances for all I know. But, and there was the touring production, which Harold Clurman directed. But it is really wild that Atkinson doesn't sort of talk about Brando very much, because he's so focused on Jessica Tandy, because she's the most famous person in that production. Kim Hunter, Carl Malden, and Marlon Brando are not famous at that point. The actor studio had just been founded. They didn't sort of know what was coming. By the time the movie is made a few years later, and it's at that point only Marlon Brando's second film, his first movie is like a not that great. He's really great in it. And Rudy Bond, who's also in Streetcar, is really good in it. But movie about veterans, paraplegic veterans, trying to adjust to life again. But Streetcar Named Desire, I mean, that performance, if you go back and watch that film today, or if you've never seen it, please go watch that film today. You can still sense that like something revolutionary is taking place while you watch it. It's wild. Brando doesn't really appear in the movie for about 12 minutes. You see sort of glimpses of him, and then almost at exactly the 12-minute mark, Kazan cuts to a close-up of him, and he's heart-stoppingly beautiful. That's part of it. He's so fucking beautiful in that movie. And then he's just doing all these things that like, they're just epochal. They're just, I don't even sort of, I describe it at length in the book. So I'm sort of, it's weird that I'm at a loss of words here, but he just seems more real and more alive and more interesting than everyone else, and between that and only a couple years later On the Waterfront, these have this huge influence on American acting. Every man who moves to New York to be an actor wants to be Brando. Gene Hackman said, all of us, when we moved to New York, we were all doing Brando impressions. It was very embarrassing because we thought doing a Brando impression is what good acting is. And sure enough, if you watch James Dean's performances, clearly he thought doing a Brando impression is what good acting is. And, everyone's coming to New York. Everyone wants to enroll in the actor studio because Brando was there. And because Kazan's associated with the actor studio, and he's quickly becoming the most important American film and theater director at the same time, he's then casting out of the studio and bringing all of those people to Broadway and Hollywood, right? Ben Gazzara, for, to give an example. But the weird irony of that is that by the time Brando was making Streetcar, he wasn't really at the studio anymore. And the reason why he wasn't really at the studio anymore is, first of all, he was like a mercurial dude who, didn't like to do the same thing over and over again. He was sort of a mischievous guy and very easily bored. That was one reason. But the other reason was that he really didn't like Lee Strasberg. He had actually studied with Stella Adler. But because of his affiliation with the studio, and because of the style of his performances, he would forever be associated in the public eye with the method. He would tell reporters over and over again, I'm not a method actor. I don't like Lee Strasberg. He's a tacky man who took credit for my work. It's all Stella and Kazan. Stella and Kazan are the people who taught me how to act. And it's sort of like no one would listen. It's a really weird thing. It's one of many very strange, widespread misconceptions about the method.
Now, we've been talking about some of these figures like Brando. You spend some time in the book talking about actors like Sidney Poitier and especially Kim Stanley as these exemplars of the method approach. But it's striking how there's some of the few non-white men who figure in the conventional narrative of how method acting arose. I'm curious what you think might be behind that and what it might say about the method and how we kind of think about acting and actors more broadly.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of that has to do with stuff that is external to the method, that has to do with the industry and which roles were available and who's getting paid attention to and all sorts of things like that. I mean, I could rattle off a list right now of important actresses who were method or who worked at the studio. Kim Stanley didn't do a lot of movies, but as a stage actor, she's incredibly important. Jo Van Fleet, Eva Marie Saint, Shelley Winters, Kim Hunter. Moving forward in time, you've got Ellen Burstyn. I mean, Ellen Burstyn is one of the greatest living actors of either, of any gender, really. And she's the person who took over the actor studio when Lee Strasberg died. Jane Fonda. I mean, by the 70s, it's like everyone is working at the actor studio. So the list goes on and on and on. There is some controversy among method scholarship about whether there is something inherent to the method that is harmful to women and people of color, because there are so few kind of famous ones. So, did it destroy people like Kim Stanley, who descended into alcoholism and mental illness in the second half of her life, or Marilyn Monroe, who, worked with and was very close to the Strasbergs, and they had a kind of ultimately for her disastrous, I think, relationship. Although, how much responsibility and agency, how much responsibility Monroe herself bears for that, I think, is an open question. There's something weirdly sexist to me about denying Marilyn Monroe any agency about who she chose to hire as her acting coach. You know what I mean? Like, she's an adult. She was making choices. So there's a lot of debate. There's two, if you want to get a sort of sense of the scope of this debate, there's two books that I would recommend you read. An Actress Prepares, Women and the Method by Rosemary Malague, which takes a kind of negative look on some of the relationship there. And Women, Method Acting in the Hollywood Film by Carrie Walsh, which argues that actually the method was incredibly important to the feminist project of a lot of those actors. I think with Poitier, for example, I don't think Poitier could have navigated the minefield of representation in the 60s that he navigated so brilliantly without the method, because, or without some sort of Stanislavski technique, because of its emphasis on subtext and suppression and repression and the revelation of what's going on underneath. Because what Poitier had to be able to do, and if you look at those movies, particularly once he becomes famous, because his early movies like Paris Blues and Edge of the City, he can actually have fun, but that changes pretty quickly. If you, what he's doing often is he's in a room and white people are saying terrible shit around him, and he's sort of stoically bearing it, or he's reacting to it in some way, but he's often quite silent reacting to other actors. And so what the method allows him to do is have a really complicated reaction that can reveal to the black or, maybe liberal white audience sort of what's going on under the surface, while hiding it from the rest of the audience. Like he's giving sort of two different performances at once for two different kinds of audiences. And I think that without the emphasis on subtext, I don't know that he would have been able to do it as well as he did. I mean, he was a genius. I'm not taking anything away from him, but I'm just saying, I think there's a way in which it enabled that navigation. At the same time, here's where I think it gets thorny. Acting teachers are trusted with the power to discriminate between the authentic and the inauthentic. And our ideas of what is authentic are, to some extent, implicitly shaped by stereotypes. And so you can see how that could lead to some really, shitty stuff, frankly, because you're trusting someone to tell you whether what you're doing is truthful or not, but they have, whether they know it or not, an idea in their head about what an authentic female performance or authentic black performance looks like. I mean, I think it's unavoidably true that that's going to be a problem, regardless of what kind of acting style you're pursuing. But the method was became the dominant one, so it becomes a really big problem within that one.
Your final chapters go into how the method transitioned to Hollywood, and eventually how the term kind of lost some of its meaning. What's your sense of how the concept of the method continues to shape our understanding of what constitutes quote unquote good acting, perhaps maybe especially in the theater?
Well, I think that we live in a world created by the method. And so we live in a world with some of the assumptions of taste that the method gave us. So even if, not everyone's going and using sense memory, we still want a performance that feels lived in, that feels like the person is really becoming the character on some level, that feels vulnerable, that feels honest, that feels true. These are a lot of sort of loaded words I'm using, but we have some general idea of what I mean by them. And those are all sort of the method standards of quality. So we still have its standards of quality, even as the term in the public eye has come to mean a sort of very weird thing that has almost nothing to do with what it actually is or what teachers of the method would teach you.
We'll post links in our show notes about the history of the method, as well as information about Isaac's book, The Method, How the 20th Century Learned to Act, as well as where you can find it. Isaac, thank you so much for sharing the story behind the method with us today.
Hey, it is such a pleasure to come on this podcast and talk to you.
If you'd like to continue today's conversation, please visit theaterhistorypodcast.net and follow @theaterhistory on Twitter. Just a note, theater is spelled THEATRE in our website URL, and it's spelled TER at the end in our Twitter handle. Our theme music is The Black Crook Gallop, which comes to us courtesy of the New York Public Library Libretto Project and Adam Roberts. Thanks as well to Tip Kress, who designed our logo. And finally, thank you for listening.